Hi, everyone, back to Evermore YouTube channel. Is Chris back with my thought stroke rant of the day. I don't normally do videos about press conferences. I leave that to better people like Paul from the Toon Review who do a great job. I don't normally do press conference reviews unless something comes out that is quite newsworthy. But the press conference that we were all waiting for Eddie Howe for the Fulham game, weirdly enough, was always going to be largely dominated by the tiny weird Derby fallout because the game was kind of over, gone. Eddie Howe wasn't really asked a great deal of questions. You had Jamie Carragher sticking up for him on Sky because he wants to be the next England manager. There wasn't really much analysing or interrogating of what on earth went wrong with the tiny weird Derby. So this was the journalist's chance to do that. Now, whilst there was some difficult questions asked in the press conference, I still think that Eddie Howe got out of that one quite lightly, to be fair, even though the manager himself turned the questions or termed the questions as negative by the press pack, which I thought was hilarious. I thought, tell you what, Eddie, give you 10 minutes with Newcastle fans asking you questions, and then you would hear some negative questions, mate. If you thought they were bad, Jesus wept. Wait to hear the kind of questions that we'd throw at you. But there were some interesting points that come from the video as well, from the press conference, and also the Bruno Guimaraes situation as well, where we've got Bruno's initial reaction to Bruno's then watered down reaction. I was on Sky earlier on today, and I was asked a question about it, and I said that I think somebody above has had a word with Bruno Guimaraes to change his terminology, change his tone, because what he said was a lot more kind of in fitting with how the fans felt, but it was the opposite of the kind of calm, occupational therapist rhetoric that Eddie Howe uses. Now, Eddie Howe is an incredibly intelligent, articulate individual. He's clearly read a lot of books about these kind of things. He's been on that high performance podcast with Jake Humphrey. He's a very well-rounded bloke. He's got great techniques in terms of how to deal with stress management and pressure and all those types of things, right? And that's fantastic. That's fabulous, right? I've read some stuff as well. I've spoke to people about those kind of methods because life is fucking hard, man. Life is difficult. Never mind being a football fan. Never mind being a football manager. Life is stressful. Life is hard. Shit gets tough. Shit gets real. And you need to figure out a way to try to deal with things. And you need to have, processes and procedures and everything in place. And that's great, right? But I'm not sure Eddie Howe talking the way that he is in these kind of interactions is actually making the fans feel any better, because you sometimes feel a little bit patronized, a little bit condescending, that you're talking to us like that. Take some fucking ownership and just show some honesty and say, do you know what? That's not how I set the team up. That's not how I wanted them to play. I'm not very happy about it. We're going to work on the training pitch. We're going to come back stronger. I apologize to the fans. I'm not having it. That would have been enough after the game or in this press conference as well. That kind of point of view was kind of coaxed out of him a little bit by some of the journalist questions. Some of them were quite difficult. I think Jordan from the Geordie Journals asked him a question that kind of put him on his toes in terms of how the team is changing, and he was talking about the intensity. And I think I think Jordan mentioned the intensity. I think Craig Hope mentioned the intensity, and he started to talk about how you can't play with that intensity all of the time. Well, fucking play with it sometime, Eddie. When was the last time we really saw a press from this team? We haven't seen a press all season, outside of Liverpool, that was played on raw emotion because of the Isaac situation. I firmly believe that game was raw emotion. The crowd, the players, the management, everything. They wanted to fuck Liverpool up. They wanted to show Liverpool that they weren't better than Newcastle, or Newcastle could get something off them, and Alexander Isak was a wanker. That's what they wanted to show them, right, in that game. And that's why that game was up there with those levels. Same with the Barcelona game in the Champions League. First time, Barcelona come to Newcastle since the 90s. The vibes were there. The nostalgia, everything was there. And that's why the energy was there in that game as well. But by and large, most of the games have been flat as a fucking pancake. There's been no intensity. There's been no press. And weirdly enough, I've been saying this a long time. I've spotted a couple of things come onto social media recently that there's no surprise that Newcastle's intensity has dropped right off the face of a cliff ever since James Bunce was put into post. Now, James Bunce was put into post to prevent injuries in the Newcastle United squad, and he did that successfully. Really, Alexander Isak played more football, Tonali played more football, Joe Linton played more football. The injuries weren't as frequent as they were previously with that high intense press that Eddie Howe played when he was burning people's fucking hamstrings out like Thanos with the gauntlet. It was just turned to dust, gone, everybody was fucked. But you got to find a kind of happy medium between that high intensity level where you got 3 or 4 men hurrying people in possession, making them make mistakes, pushing the keeper, making them make mistakes, pushing teams high, pushing them back, not letting them get over the halfway line. That was Newcastle's Eddie Howe's Newcastle at their best. Yes, you can't do that every single game, but you can't go the total opposite way and just be zombies and drop off, which is exactly what they did in the derby. They did absolutely nothing in terms of the previous Eddie Howe identity, intensity, identity, Newcastle. They didn't do that. They were completely, identity-less, if that's a word. You know what the fuck they are, and I don't know what they are. Are they trying to be a possession-based team? Are they trying to be a team that sits in a deep block and then bursts on the counter with pace out wide? That only works if your wingers can actually do fuck all. Because Anthony Gordon, Mr. Headband, he thinks that he only has to show up for X amount of games a season, or when the England manager's in the crowd potentially, or Anthony Elanga has just clearly forgotten how to play football. Or Elliot Anderson made him look much better. Not Forrest Hewitt, which one out is the right answer there. But 55 million quid for that guy, waste of money, shit signing, cut your losses, go get somebody better in January, in my opinion. But he was asked some more difficult questions. But some of the stuff that he come out with concerned me a little bit. But going back to the Bruno thing, what worries me a little bit about this situation is I want my captain to come out and be raw like that. I want him to come out and I want him to tell me as a fan that he's not happy, that we didn't do anything right. We didn't do the basics right. We couldn't hold the ball. We couldn't tackle. We couldn't pass. We couldn't shoot. We couldn't cross. We weren't a threat. That's not what we are. We're a better team than them. Like, we should show that. We're disappointed. We're sorry for the fans. I want to hear that and I want to see that. But if Eddie Howe has told Bruno Guimaraes, or the club's hierarchy of shit houses and suits have told Bruno Guimaraes that he has to go out and then apologise for all of that and put out a fucking PG statement, watering it down, it loses its potency. Charlie Austin said that to me earlier on today. He's right. It loses its potency. We don't want Bruno to do that. We want Bruno to be pissed off. We want Bruno to be as angry as we are as a player. Doesn't mean he has to go in the Sunderland dressing room and fucking headbutt Granit Xhaka, but we want to see him pissed off and annoyed about it. We want to see a reaction, against Fulham and against Chelsea. But, I was watching the Geordie Journo's video and Liam was completely on the money. I don't think Eddie Howe understands what this derby means to this region, to these fans. I don't think he gets it. I don't think the players get it. I think Bruno gets it. Dan Burn clearly gets it. Lewis Miley will get it, but we didn't see a lot of intensity from him. But he's not an intense kind of a kid. He's very calm. He's very laid back. And that's part of the reason why he's able to do what he does at 19. I mean, at 19, I was fucking swaggering over the swing bridge, going to Baja Beach Club. Remember that? What a place that was, by the way. It's a fucking office block now or something. But 19 years old, didn't have that kind of mental strength or composure that Lewis Miley has. And he has that because he's calm, and he's not an intense, in your face, start a fight in the phone box type character. Joe Linton is, I always say there's games that need Joe Linton and games that don't need Joe Linton. The derby needed Joe Linton. It needed that X factor. But that goes back to questions that the press pack don't ask Eddie Howe. Now, there were a bit more probing in this press conference. They were asking a bit more difficult questions about, are you worried about your team's lack of mental strength? I think George Caulkin asked that. Are you worried about the identity of the team? Jordan asked it. Craig Hope said, have you lost your hardness? Have you gone soft? There were some more difficult questions than previous, and I was glad to see that. But I would be wanting to ask questions like, why did you not change it at halftime when you could see that Sunderland didn't have a great deal of offer going forward and you were just sitting back? Why didn't you make the changes at halftime? Nick Voltemada was clearly not in the game. Neither was Gordon or Elanga. You had the three you could have brought off the bench at halftime. Why didn't you just make the change and start the second half strong for the first 10, 15 minutes, get in front and then sit on the lead? Why didn't you do that? They don't ask those questions. They don't ask those difficult questions. I'm sure I have a happy clapper in my comments going, oh, well, what do you know about football? No, you're not a manager. No. I'm a football fan and a content creator. I can ask questions. That's called freedom of speech, and that's what I'm doing. So go off and clap in the corner, mate. But that's the kind of question I want the journalist to ask, in my opinion. Ask some more hard questions like that. They then talked about the defense. He talked about, we're in a real fragile position in the defense. Nobody said, well, what about the under-23s, Eddie? Is there anybody from the under-23s that are catching your eye that maybe can come into the squad? Nobody asked that question. You know why? Because he doesn't use youth. The reason that we're in a fragile state in the back line of the squad is because the majority of them are over 30, because Eddie Howe has kept them for too long. I mean, Jamal Lascelles was talked about in this press conference. Are you fucking joking me? Jamal Lascelles I mean, fuck me. Yes, he's been a good player for us in the past. When we went down, Jamal Lascelles' shining moment as a Newcastle player was bollocking the half-arsed, half-hearted professionals that just watched us get relegated. And this kid bollocked them at Southampton and then become the captain. And he put in a great performance as a Newcastle player, getting us promoted from the Championship and in the Premier League. But he should have been sold 4 years ago. And people are still talking about him coming back into the squad. Now, he's 32 years old. Kieran Trippier's 35. Fabian Schär's 33. Dan Burns, 33. Neil Kraft's 31, 32. They're too old. We have not refreshed that part of the squad. And that's the reason why injuries are becoming as frequent and as long as they are. When you get older, it's only human nature. It takes you longer to recover from an injury. The older you get, your body gets weaker. Your immune system gets weaker. You know, you're not as strong as you used to be. You don't bounce back as quick as you used to do. That's human nature. But this manager is insisting on keeping these players way beyond their peak years. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in right now. And he won't look at the youth development, and nobody's asking him the question. Ask him the question. I think one journalist asked him about Alex Murphy, and he just glossed over it really, really quickly. He talked about, because he gave him an out, he talked about Jacob Murphy at right wing back, and Eddie Howe jumped on that. He didn't jump on Alex Murphy. I'd have pushed him on Alex Murphy. I'd have said, look, Alex Murphy's been on the bench all season. He's been in and around the first team squad. If he's needed, you think he's ready? And I think the journalist did kind of throw that in at the end, but Eddie Howe completely ignored it, and he went by it because he doesn't want to play youth. He wants to stick with these over 30 players week in, week out. You know, we've got young Leo Shahar in the under-23s, who's a good young right back. Why is he not on the bench as cover for Tino Livramento? If Tino Livramento gets hurt, who's going to go right back? Jacob Murphy at right back? You know, Lewis Miley at right back? I mean, that was a joke the other week. Why are you not giving young players a chance, Eddie Howe? And why are the press pack not asking that question? That's what disappoints me about them. They're good lads, the journalists. I've got a lot of time for a lot of them. I've met them, socialized with them. They're fucking good guys. But maybe, I don't know, maybe they're too scared to ask the question in case they get shunned by the hierarchy of the club, the press officers or Eddie Howe himself, or maybe they don't want to ruin the relationship they've got with certain players or whatever. It may just very well be the politics of journalism is why they're not asking the question. But I want to know as a supporter, why aren't you using the youth team more? Why not? I mean, you know, Anthony Gordon and Anthony Elanga stinking out the joint at the Stadium of Light. If it was me in the Fulham game, I'd drop the pair of them to the under-23s and I'd promote, you know, Song Shu and Sanusi, and I'd get them in the fucking first team on the bench. I'll start with Bonds and Murphy and give the young lads 20 minutes off the bench if the game's going our way. Same with Alfie Harrison. I'd give him a shout because Tonali, he's checked out. And nobody asked him a question about Sandro Tonali. Are you worried about Sandro Tonali's form? Is he suffering from injury? He looks off. What's going on with him? Nobody asked that question either. They glossed past that question. Maybe they know more than I do. Maybe they know Tonali is itching for a move and they don't want to scratch and poke the bear on that one, because I think Tonali's already checked out and I think he's already looking for his next move away from the club. It's Isak vibes all over again. We buried Isak for Downing tools after we found out what was going on. Tonali's doing the same thing, in my opinion, guys. I'm sorry. It's not an injury. It's not fatigue. He wants to wait. He's had enough, and you can see it all over his face. Don't play him if he doesn't want to put it in. Don't play him until he can come and put it in, and then put him back in the squad. We are all obsessed with how great Tonali is. He's been rubbish for weeks and weeks and weeks now. He's not giving us anywhere near what we need. And take your blinkers off and have a look at his performances. They're nowhere near good enough. It's a player who wants out, and it's clear. Why do you think we're getting linked to all these midfielders? No smoke without fire, in my opinion. But that was something I took umbrage with. They didn't ask him about youth. They didn't ask him about that. And then they were talking about what do you think the problem is? Do you think it's because you got so many games in a week and it's the lack of training? And Eddie Howe then turned around and he said, that definitely plays a part as well. It's not causing Aston Villa any problems, Eddie. You know, Aston Villa are flying. They've got, midweek games and they've got Premier League games as well. It's not causing them any issues. You know, it's not causing Chelsea any issues. It's not causing City any issues. Yeah, they've got this unbelievable squad, so it's hard to use them as a comparison. But if you look at us and Aston Villa, we're kind of like for like there in terms of squads. Villa are flying. You know, they rotate their squad more than we do. Eddie Howe doesn't rotate his squad. It's always been Eddie Howe's biggest problem, rotating that squad. He does not do it. And that is a problem. It's always been a problem for Eddie Howe. You know, it was okay when the squad was small and you didn't have the depth of squad to rotate. But he's had a depth of squad now for a period of time and he's not rotated. Some of them are shite. I mean, Alanga's dreadful. I can understand you're not rotating out your right winger because that guy can't kick in a fucking straight line. But other players, there's been times where he could have rotated and he hasn't rotated, and that is a concern. That is a real concern. And that question wasn't asked. He was then asked about, I think he was asked about his signings as well. The journalist did focus a little bit on the signings, and he talked about bringing in, was it 5 or 6 players? And this is the bit that made me laugh, because not a single fucking journalist would have asked this question. And I kind of get why, right? I would have, because I'm a fan and a content creator. And I'm sure others would have done it all. True Geordie, Paul from Toon Review, some of the guys from True Faith, I'm sure they would have asked the same fucking question. But he was talking about how, it's really hard to throw 6 players into a team, with a lack of training in a new league and just have them, hit the ground running. Sunderland got no problem with Eddie Howe. How many new players have they got? They've got about fucking 12, right? I think that team that beat us at the weekend, there was only about 1 player or 2 players in that team. If it was in the championship, I think, with them, they've got 8 new players. They got no problem with it. They're playing in the Premier League and they're playing well, so don't give me that bullshit. That's the kind of stuff that I feel like he insults your intelligence when he says those kind of things. And he's a very intelligent bloke, don't get me wrong. I think he's insulting fans' intelligence when he comes out with shit like that. So I didn't buy that one either. But, the question of the mentality of the players came up as well. And he talked about that. And again, he spun that. And he's very political, Eddie Howe. If he was wearing a suit, you'd think he was one of the fucking MPs on the TV getting asked the question. It's only because he's wearing a trackie, he's a football manager. But he's very, very political in terms of the way he answers. I remember, I don't watch I'm a Celebrity a great deal, but I know, was it Matt Hancock, who sadly says he is a Newcastle fan? I don't think we claim him. But anyway, he said there's something called the pivot, where they don't answer the question, they go back to a point. And I feel like Eddie Howe pivots a lot. Even when he's asked a question that's a bit more challenging or makes him uncomfortable, he pivots back to a point where he doesn't have to quite answer that question. And the journalists don't really push him on it. And I think they either give up, or that they just think he's not going to answer that. We'll move on to the next one, because they've got to find a little bit of time with him. So I do sympathize and empathize a little bit, because the journalists can't ask maybe what they always want to ask because of the nature of the job that they do, the time scale that they've got, and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of get it. It disappoints me at times, because I think they could be a bit harder and a bit more probing and a bit more kind of stronger with the questioning. Even in this one as well, even though the questions were better slightly, I still think they could have been a little bit more stronger and deeper in that as well. But that's the bit with Eddie Howe. So they talked about mentality, and he talked about preparation, and he talked about you got to prepare and do your job and all this kind of stuff. And I get that, I understand that. As I say, he's clearly read a lot of kind of, mental strength books and done a lot of mental strength workshops and all that kind of stuff, right? But football has something as well, which is an unpredictable element in a football game. A moment, you can prepare for a moment, and something out of the blue can happen that you do not expect. A red card, an own goal, or something like that. And I said this on Sky to Charlie Austin as well. When players aren't performing at the level you want them to be, you need a leader on the pitch to get them up and fire them up. I grew up watching the football era of Roy Keane's and Patrick Vieira's and Tony Adams, and then the later stages was John Terry's and guys like that. These guys did not accept anything other than excellence, especially like Roy Keane. You saw Roy Keane bollocking players on the pitch for not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Where's the bollocking from our lads on the pitch? I don't see a single player bollocking anybody on that pitch. Bruno, after the game, he says he's gutted, he's livid and all that. And it's the right tone. It's the right tone. But where's the screaming on the pitch? I'd have been fucking yelling at Anthony Elanga to get a hold of that ball. I'd be screaming at Gordon to beat his man and get wide. You don't see any of that. Football's all just a little bit too nicey, and little points here and there, and little eye contacts and little tips of the wing. It's like fucking baseball, stealing second base. I don't see anybody screaming at anyone to do something anymore. That's what football lacks right now. It lacks characters and leaders, and certainly our team 100% does. Now, Kieran Trippier's legs are going. There's no doubt about that at all. He's nowhere near the player that he used to be, but his gob is absolutely fine. And you do miss Trippier's mouth when he's not on the pitch, because he's that kind of a player. Especially when you go live. That's right, Happy Clappers. I do go to some games. You can see him. He's constantly talking to all the players. He's pointing. He's moving people inward. He's telling them what position to take up. I think Kieran Trippier will be an excellent coach, and very soon. And Newcastle missed that when he's not there. So we need to be signing players who have that kind of character as well. Recently we were linked to Scott McTominay, and some fans will go, "Oh, fucking hell." Scott McTominay is that type of player as well. You need players with a bit about them, a little bit of fire, a little bit of gusto, a little bit of fucking, I'm not having this shit. Like Granit Xhaka's that player for Sunderland, even though he's kind of going towards the end of his career. He's that player. You could see him screaming and bollocking people. I think he left one on Bruno and he told him fucking get up, and we don't see that anymore with Newcastle. And that goes into what Craig Hope had said about losing your edge, losing your toughness, your shithousery. Newcastle used to have that. We used to kick players and fucking elbow players, and Nick Pope would waste time, would wind people up, and the likes of Havertz would lose their mind and get a red card, or Nicholas Jackson would lose his mind and get a red card, or Liverpool would be going fucking mad, screaming at the referee that we're doing this or doing that. Klopp called us the biggest time-wasting team in the Premier League, right? But it was effective and it worked. That's not happening anymore for Newcastle. So something has happened down the line to stop us being that team. And I've got to put it down to the James Bunce appointment. I have to, because as a performance director or whatever the fuck he is, whatever his title is, they just seem to have stepped away from that intensity, that aggression, that in-your-face type play that you need in a derby game more than anything. But in big games as well, where you want to rattle the team, take them off their game, stop them with their pretty passes and their triangular movements and all that kind of stuff. Glasses falling off my face. Yeah, I'm getting that animated. But that's the kind of thing that you need from a team. And Newcastle were effective like that. Are we missing Alexander Isak up front? We are, because we're missing that explosive pace and just the threat of him, his ability to drop a shoulder and move inward and do something. But you know what? Alexander Isak's missing us too, because the team that he's in right now was not the right team for him. It's not geared up to give him the ball. And that's why he's struggling so much, but we don't have that player anymore. Wissa could be that player in a similar way, right? But he's nowhere near fit. But if you've got a different centre forward, you've got to play a different way. But mentality is also about being able to be proactive and smell danger and make changes in that moment when you can see something's not right or something's not happening. Make some tweaks, make some changes. And Eddie Howe doesn't do that, but he wasn't asked that question by the press pack. So that disappointed me as well in the press conference. But you can definitely see he was uncomfortable with the questions being the way they were. A lot of journalists caveated their questions with how wonderful he is and, oh, Eddie, you're so wonderful, little doughy eyes. And remember when you won the Carabao Cup, Eddie, singing little songs, playing harps and blowing him kisses. And that's the problem I have with a lot of the press pack, is that they're so enamored and engaged with this man. And he's a really impressive character, right? If I was sitting talking to him, I'd probably think, oh, he's a fucking great guy, this guy, what an impressive guy. But Newcastle have been really, really poor this season, really struggled. Eddie Howe's negative tactics, one-dimensional tactics, and his lack of in-game management and his lack of ability to smell danger in-game and make changes before shit happens is costing Newcastle points. And that's a fact. I said that on Sky before I was cut off very briefly earlier on, because it was only a small time window. But that is what is happening with Newcastle United this season. We can't smell danger. We can't react to something before it happens. We're reactive, not proactive. The players, I think, aren't showing up for certain games. There's games where they think are beneath them. I generally mean that. Likes of Anthony Gordon in particular. Anthony Gordon thinks he's up here. Anthony Gordon thinks he should be playing for Real Madrid or Barcelona. I generally think in his mind, that's where he thinks he is. He's putting in performances he wouldn't get a game for fucking Reading or Barnsley, the way he's playing. He shows up when he can be asked. Like, the most movement he made at the weekend was when he was getting subbed off and he ran off. If you want to be a top player, a big players show up in games like this. I remember watching people like Paul Scholes, David Beckham, Frank Lampard, Steven Gerrard. It doesn't matter if it was Real Madrid in the quarterfinal of the Champions League or if it was fucking Dagenham and Redbridge away on a pitch that was a multi-story car park. Steven Gerrard would be giving you all that energy. David Beckham would be giving you all that energy. They were top players, Anthony Gordon. They showed up for any game and every game that they were asked to show up for. So if you want to be a top player, when you go back and watch some clips of them in the FA Cup or something like that, and then fucking go and look at yourself in the mirror and ask if you're giving everything you can to this football club. Anthony Langer's a lost cause for me. I think it's a bad signing. I don't think he's a good enough player for Newcastle United where we need to be right now. I think we should cut our losses and get a better player in the summer, or certainly even in January if we can, and get shot, or even just promote one of the young players up through the ranks like a Songshu or a Sanusi and see if they do any better than Langer, because all he does is run. I know Liam Kennedy said it perfectly. Put him in the Swedish relay team, which is a great comment. Go watch the Jody Cherno's video if you haven't. It's awesome. But he's just a runner. He can't do anything other than run. That's all he can do. He's a shit player. And I wrote him off fucking weeks ago. Go back and watch. I wrote him off weeks ago. The kid's not good enough. Not for 55 million quid. Not in the summer where you could have signed Brian Mbeumo, Mohamed Kudus, even went for Semenyo, who looks like he's destined to go to Man U or Man City now, or go abroad and look for players. Newcastle have completely shit the bed by blowing 55 million quid on that kid. And that's the facts, Jack. I'm sorry. It really, really is. And the Ramsey thing doesn't look good. Eddie Howe was very, very quick to move away from Ramsey conversations, which pretty much said Ramsey's not giving it in training, not putting it in. Now, Ramsey might be going to training and being mint and scoring 6 or 7 goals, but he might not be running hard enough or fast enough for what Eddie Howe wants from his players. And then maybe that's a bad deal in terms of Ramsey wasn't the right mentality for Eddie Howe. We always talked about this no dickhead policy thing that used to be implemented in the club. I think that was very mythical, to be honest with you, because most footballers are dickheads, let's be honest with you, especially when they get to a certain level of success and they think they don't need to do A, B, or C anymore. Case in point, Anthony Gordon, I've just been talking about, Alexander Isak, another. We thought he was, absolutely brilliant. It turns out he was a complete knob, and that's just footballers in general. Once they get to that level and they think they're better than you got to shift them on. You got to get rid, cash in, and go and buy somebody else. That's something that Aston Villa have done better than us, moving players on, the likes of John Duran, Douglas Luiz, Diaby, those players. We haven't done that. That's when Newcastle have struggled with their squad rotational management. That's why Villa look fresher than we do right now. They refresh their team better than we do. They rotate their squad better than we do. Emery knows how to do that better than Eddie Howe does. And that's why they're in a better situation than we are now. And they can manage 2 games a week and we can't. But I did feel that the questions were slightly better than they have been. But I do think he was let off the hook a little bit as well. But the Bruno Guimaraes thing does concern me, because if our captain can't come out and speak the truth and shoot from the hip and then get a little bit battered by upstairs or the manager himself, that's a little bit of a concern. I don't think, to be fair, Howe said he was 90% right. No, he wasn't, Eddie. He was 120% right with what he said. The performance was dreadful. And I know Eddie Howe is trying to remain, civil and articulate and intelligent and classy and all those kind of things. Sometimes you just got to say that's not good enough. It's not good enough. It's not what we expect. It's not what I expect from our players. It's not what we we expect to produce for the fans. And I'm really disappointed. And I'll tell the players that, and they're going to know about that. Believe you me. That's all he had to say. But if he's worried that some of these prima donnas are going to pitch a bitch fit and run away crying, holding a headband, and wondering why they're still here, they should be at Liverpool or Arsenal, then that's an issue, because maybe it's too close to the players. But there is a lot of problems in this Newcastle setup right now. I think the manager's tactics have grown a little bit stale. I think the players aren't responding to it as well. I think we need a refresh of players. There's too many old players in the squad in key areas. We lack creativity. The wingers aren't good enough. Harvey Barnes is in good goal scoring form, but outside of that, no one's really producing. Botman's constantly injured. Murphy's got a knock as well. Tonali looks disinterested. Voldemort has started really well, but I feel like we've given him maybe too much football in a short period of time. He's looking very tired and fatigued. Whistler's back, great, but he's not fit. Asula is injured and also out of favour. So, we keep hearing Newcastle can do business in January. Maybe that's what it needs. Maybe it needs 2 or 3 signings to just refresh things in January and also raise the game of the other players to think, shit, this guy could be after my space. But what worries me about this manager, and I said this before, is it doesn't matter how bad you play the next game. Now, I'm recording this pre-Fulham, and if I see Anthony Elanga and Anthony Gordon start that game and they deliver another shit half-arsed performance, I'll lose my mind. The guys in the crowd will lose their mind. And a lot of fans could really be asking questions about the manager again, about why he's putting his faith in players who don't deserve the opportunity. But, we've got a chance to win and get to a cup semi-final, but you've still got City in there, you've still got Chelsea in there, you've still got Arsenal in there in terms of the Carabao Cup. So there's no guarantee that would win that. But huge game of football coming, huge week of football coming with Fulham tomorrow, which we'll be back for the post-match live on. Chelsea the weekend, again, we'll be back for that. We'll do a preview for that. Then we've got Manchester United on Boxing Day. I feel sorry for any of them poor bastards who are travelling down to that with no transport, with a rotten kickoff time at 8 o'clock at night on a Boxing Day. I will be firmly full of chocolate and pigs in blanket, but I will be on the post-match for that game. If you are watching it at home and you want to listen to me talk after the game. But yeah, disappointed with the questions weren't hard enough, but happy they were a little bit more challenging. But I think the more Eddie Howe's team put in lackluster performances like the weekend, the tougher them questions are going to need to be, because people want answers. But thanks for watching, guys. Remember, like and subscribe. Keep it evermore. Have a belt there. We'll see you later. Cheers.
They have done it.